Divorce is often viewed as the end of a relationship, a legal process that separates two people and allows them to move on with their individual lives. But beneath the surface, beyond the paperwork and the settlement, lies a complex psychological transformation that often goes unnoticed, especially in men. What actually happens to a husband after a divorce, not in court, but in his mind, his emotions, and his identity. From a psychological standpoint, divorce can trigger one of the most profound identity crises a man can experience. For years, many men unconsciously anchor their sense of self to their roles as providers, protectors, and partners. When the marriage ends, those roles vanish overnight, leaving a vacuum where meaning used to exist. Studies on post-divorce adjustment suggest that men on average experience more intense loneliness and slower emotional recovery than women, not because they love more deeply, but because their emotional world is often less developed or less socially supported. Imagine this: a husband who has spent years working long hours, believing his contribution was stability and care. After divorce, he returns to an empty apartment. Same person, same job, but suddenly everything feels pointless. The quiet becomes louder. The routine, once comforting, turns hollow. This is not just sadness. It's a loss of structure, psychological, social, and existential. Philosophically, divorce challenges one of the oldest ideas in human existence, the concept of unity through partnership. Aristotle described marriage as a union where two souls pursue a shared virtue. When that union dissolves, what remains is not merely separation, but a confrontation with the self. A man who once defined himself as a husband must now face the question, who am I without her? In modern society, this transition is complicated by cultural expectations. Men are often taught to move on quickly, to stay strong, to suppress vulnerability. But this cultural script conflicts with psychological reality. Suppressed grief doesn't disappear, it evolves. It turns into workaholism, emotional withdrawal, or even self-destructive behavior. According to research from the Journal of Men's Health, divorced men are significantly more likely to suffer from depression, substance abuse, and social isolation compared to their female counterparts. Yet, not all outcomes are negative. For some men, divorce becomes a catalyst for growth, a painful but necessary transformation that forces introspection. It's an unplanned form of individuation, a process Carl Jung described as the path towards self-realization. When stripped of external identity markers, husband, provider, partner, a man is pushed to redefine himself through inner values rather than external validation. When a marriage ends, the first stage for most men is psychological disorientation. Divorce doesn't simply dissolve a legal bond, it dismantles a mental framework. The husband's mind, conditioned for years to think in terms of we, suddenly must revert to I. This shift seems simple linguistically, but psychologically, it is profound. The identity built around shared decisions, routines, and emotional dependencies must be reconstructed from scratch. Stage 1. The shock and denial phase. Initially, many men respond with denial. They maintain routines as if nothing has changed, continuing to text their ex-spouse about small things, avoiding emotional conversations, or distracting themselves with work and social media. Psychologists call this transitional inertia, the inability to adapt to a new identity. Because the brain resists emotional disruption, men are often conditioned to seek control through logic or action. So when the emotional foundation collapses, they compensate by over-focusing on external order. A husband who once coordinated family schedules may now obsessively organize his apartment, his work files, or his gym routine. It's not about neatness, it's about control. The subconscious mind tries to restore a sense of balance in a world that feels unpredictable. However, denial is not sustainable. When the distractions fade, the suppressed reality surfaces in the form of grief. This is where emotional avoidance turns into emotional overload. Stage 2. The grieving and withdrawal phase. Psychologically, the grief that follows divorce mirrors the stages experienced after death, because in essence, a part of one's identity has died. The Kühler-Ross model: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance fits almost perfectly, but for men, these stages manifest differently. Anger often replaces sadness. Many men externalize pain through irritation or resentment, not because they're inherently angry, but because society allows them to express rage more easily than vulnerability. Anger gives the illusion of strength. Sadness exposes weakness. This is why some men seem emotionally distant or cold after divorce. It's not detachment, it's emotional camouflage. As time progresses, bargaining surfaces. Thoughts like, maybe I can win her back if I change, or maybe I should have been more understanding, are common. This mental negotiation reflects an effort to regain a lost sense of purpose. The brain, wired for pattern recognition and problem solving, keeps replaying scenarios to find an alternative outcome. But once reality fully sets in, depression often follows. This stage is critical. It's here that the silence of independence becomes deafening. Men who have relied on their partners for emotional grounding may now experience profound emptiness. According to the American Psychological Association, men are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide after divorce, a chilling statistic that reflects the psychological isolation many face. This isn't just emotional despair, it's existential confusion. When purpose is tied to family and family dissolves, the subconscious questions everything, including one's worth. Stage 3. The ego and identity collapse. Philosophically, divorce can be viewed as an ego collapse, the shattering of the constructed self. In marriage, identity often fuses with role. The husband is not just a man, he is the husband, the father, the provider. These titles offer meaning and stability. Once removed, the ego experiences disintegration. Carl Jung described this as the dark night of the soul, the phase when one must confront their true self without societal labels. For many men, this stage feels like emotional freefall. They may struggle with feelings of inadequacy, guilt, or shame. In psychological terms, this is role loss syndrome, the distress that arises when an individual loses a defining social role. It's particularly intense for men raised with traditional gender norms. A man who derives self-worth from being the breadwinner or protector now feels irrelevant. This isn't merely nostalgia, it's a collapse of identity architecture. However, this stage also offers the possibility of rebirth. Once the ego breaks, the authentic self can emerge. Stage 4. Rebuilding emotional competence. As the mind begins to adapt, a new psychological task emerges: emotional integration. Men must learn to identify and process feelings without avoidance. This is often the hardest part because it requires unlearning decades of emotional conditioning. Psychotherapist Terence Real calls this relational recovery. It's not about reconciliation with the ex-partner, but with oneself, acknowledging fear, grief, and loneliness without judgment. Some men turn to therapy, while others find solace in spirituality, philosophy, or creative expression. For instance, a divorced man who once suppressed emotion might start journaling or painting. not as a hobby, but as a form of existential repair. These outlets allow the subconscious to express what logic cannot. During this stage, self-reflection replaces self-pity. The man begins to see the divorce not as punishment, but as feedback, an opportunity to analyze past behavior patterns, attachment styles, and emotional blind spots. Psychologically, this marks the beginning of post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon where individuals experience higher levels of awareness and purpose after deep emotional loss. Stage 5. Reconnection and meaning reconstruction. After months or even years, a divorced man reaches a state of cognitive restructuring, the ability to reinterpret his past without emotional paralysis. Here, forgiveness becomes possible, not necessarily toward the ex-spouse, but toward himself. Philosophically, this stage echoes the Stoic principle of ama fatali, love your fate, accepting the divorce as a necessary part of one's evolution, rather than an error, changes the emotional narrative. Men who reach this stage often experience renewed purpose. Some rebuild relationships with their children on deeper emotional levels. Others dedicate themselves to work, travel, or mentoring. The common thread is meaning-making, turning pain into insight. Psychologists emphasize that closure doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating. The memories of the marriage remain, but they no longer dominate the emotional landscape. Interestingly, this stage also redefines masculinity. Many men begin to detach from performance-based identity, no longer seeing value only in success, wealth, or control, but in authenticity, peace, and self-understanding. Philosophical interpretation. The existential awakening. Existential philosophy offers a powerful lens for understanding post-divorce transformation. Thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre argued that meaning is not found, but created. Divorce then becomes a confrontation with existential freedom, terrifying yet liberating. Before divorce, the husband's choices were bound by marital obligations. After divorce, he faces radical freedom, the awareness that he alone shapes his life. For some, this is empowering. For others, it's paralyzing. Freedom without direction breeds anxiety. This is where existential responsibility arises. The man must now decide not only what he wants, but who he wants to be. Without the reflection of a partner, he becomes both sculptor and sculpture, forced to define himself anew. Psychologically, this aligns with Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, particularly the stage of generativity versus stagnation. Middle-aged men often seek to contribute to society or nurture others. Divorce disrupts this drive temporarily, but successful adaptation can redirect it toward mentorship, creativity, or community involvement. In this sense, the divorced man's journey mirrors a philosophical rebirth, the transition from dependency on external validation to inner autonomy. Emotional reality versus societal expectation. Despite this potential for growth, society's perception of divorced men remains conflicted. Women are often portrayed as emotionally resilient after separation, while men are depicted as emotionally lost. In truth, both experience profound change, just in different ways. Men's emotional struggles are often silent. They may not talk to friends or seek therapy, not because they don't feel pain, but because vulnerability is socially discouraged. Research from the University of Michigan shows that divorced men have fewer emotional support systems compared to divorced women. This emotional isolation can amplify mental health issues. The paradox is striking. The same cultural ideals that once gave men strength, stoicism, independence, self-control become obstacles to healing. The mind must learn a new form of strength, emotional intelligence. When men start acknowledging emotions as data rather than threats, they begin to process rather than suppress. This is when true transformation begins. The role of time and reflection. Time plays a silent yet crucial role. The psychological timeline of post-divorce recovery is not linear. Some men recover within a year, others take several. What determines the pace is not circumstance, but self-awareness. Those who reflect, journal, and seek understanding progress faster. Those who numb themselves with distractions, dating, alcohol, overwork, delay healing. In philosophical terms, avoidance postpones the necessary confrontation with self. Eventually, most men experience what psychologists call emotional recalibration, a stage where their nervous system stabilizes and they begin to feel normal again. But this new normal is different, quieter, more self-reliant, and often wiser. Divorce, when examined through both psychological and philosophical lenses, becomes more than the story of two people parting ways. It is a mirror reflecting the deeper mechanics of human identity. For men, especially, it raises a profound question. What remains when the roles that once defined you are gone? The psychological perspective.
From a psychological standpoint, a man's post-divorce transformation can be seen as a test of emotional maturity. Emotional maturity doesn't mean suppressing pain. It means integrating it. Many men are not taught this skill. They are taught control, logic, and endurance, all valuable traits, but incomplete.
Divorce exposes this gap brutally. It forces men to face emotions they have long avoided: grief, rejection, vulnerability, and fear of insignificance. The very feelings they've been conditioned to suppress now demand attention. Psychologists describe this as emotional reparenting, the process of learning, often in adulthood, how to comfort oneself in the way a nurturing parent might have done. For example, a man who grew up believing that showing sadness was weakness might, after divorce, experience uncontrollable moments of grief. The old defense mechanisms, working late, socializing, distracting himself, no longer silence the emotions. The psyche, deprived of denial, begins to self-correct. This process, though painful, is healing in disguise. In the same way that a muscle tears before it grows stronger, emotional pain becomes the raw material for psychological growth. This is what post-traumatic growth looks like, not the absence of suffering, but the emergence of wisdom through it. The philosophical perspective. Philosophically, divorce invites an existential crisis, not because life has ended, but because the structure of meaning has dissolved. Jean-Paul Sartre described this condition as anguish, the awareness of absolute freedom. When a man loses the defining boundaries of marriage, he faces the unsettling truth that he is now entirely responsible for the direction of his life. In marriage, many choices are collective. After divorce, every decision becomes a reflection of selfhood. This confrontation can feel terrifying because it removes external validation. The husband can no longer define himself through another's approval. Yet, this is also where authentic living begins. The Stoic philosophers would call this moment an awakening to what is within one's control. A divorced man cannot change the past or another person's feelings, but he can govern his perceptions, actions, and values. This recognition transforms suffering into agency. Divorce, therefore, is a philosophical trial of autonomy. It asks a man, will you collapse into self-pity, or will you reconstruct your own moral and emotional architecture? The collapse of masculine archetypes. Culturally, men are taught archetypes of strength: the stoic protector, the rational provider, the unshakable leader. These roles work well in structured systems like marriage or family, where they are rewarded, but after divorce, these archetypes often fail. Strength without connection feels hollow. Control without purpose feels meaningless. This collapse invites what Jungian psychology calls the integration of the shadow, the repressed parts of the self that society deems unmanly. The divorced man, if he's honest, begins to see that vulnerability, sensitivity, and emotional openness are not flaws, but essential components of wholeness. The paradox of masculinity emerges clearly here. True strength is not the denial of emotion, but the capacity to face it without being consumed by it. A man who learns this begins to experience life from a deeper, more conscious state. The social reflection. It is also a sociological dimension worth reflecting upon. Men's emotional struggles post-divorce are not only personal, they're systemic. Research indicates that men are less likely to have strong emotional networks outside their romantic relationship. Their partners often serve as the emotional center of their lives. When that center disappears, the result is not just loneliness, it's emotional dislocation. Women, by contrast, often maintain supportive friendships and community bonds, which act as psychological cushions. This imbalance reveals how gender norms silently shape emotional resilience. It's not that men are inherently weaker, they're simply less prepared for emotional independence, because society hasn't encouraged it. Thus, one could argue that the pain of divorce exposes not just individual vulnerability, but a cultural flaw, a collective failure to teach men emotional literacy. The philosophical rebirth.
Philosophically, this pain can be transformative. When all external definitions collapse, what remains is existential clarity. The divorced man, stripped of social identity, stands alone before the mirror of consciousness, and in that silence, he begins to encounter his authentic self, not the husband, not the father, not the provider, but the being behind all those roles. This echoes Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, or overman, not in the sense of superiority, but transcendence, to rise beyond old identities and create new meaning from one's suffering. Divorce, in this light, is a crucible, a place where the old self burns away and a new, more self-aware being can emerge. Psychologically, this transformation resembles what Abraham Maslow called self-actualization, the process of fulfilling one's true potential once basic emotional wounds are healed. Many men who endure the pain consciously emerge with new priorities: authenticity over appearance, peace over pride, and self-understanding over external validation. A reflection for the viewer. The story of what happens to a husband after divorce, then, is not merely about separation. It's about the rebirth of selfhood. It's a universal human journey disguised as a gendered experience, one that mirrors every individual's struggle to find meaning after loss. Whether you are divorced, married, or single, the deeper question is the same. What do you become when the structures that define you disappear? Divorce only magnifies a truth that life constantly presents, that identity is fluid, that meaning must be renewed, and that emotional evolution never truly ends. Through this lens, the divorced man's journey becomes not a tragedy, but a metaphor for growth, for consciousness, and for the enduring human capacity to rebuild from nothing but awareness. In the end, divorce is not simply the breaking of vows. It is the breaking of self-perception. It forces a man to face the question he may have avoided his entire life: who am I when everything familiar is gone? Psychologically, the process can feel like emotional demolition, the collapse of structure,
certainty, and identity. But like any demolition, it clears the ground for reconstruction. The man who learns to confront his loneliness, instead of fearing it, begins to rebuild from a place of truth rather than pretense. The stages of grief, denial, anger, and depression are not signs of weakness. They are the natural languages of transition. They signal that the psyche is reorganizing itself, moving from chaos toward clarity. Over time, the emotional shock of divorce transforms into a kind of internal awakening. The man who once felt powerless begins to see that the end of one identity is also the beginning of another. Philosophically, this mirrors one of life's oldest truths. Loss is not the opposite of growth. It is the condition for it. Without endings, there can be no renewal. The husband who steps out of the ruins of marriage with humility and self-awareness often becomes more grounded, more empathetic, and more alive than before.
Society rarely tells this story. Men are often portrayed as either villains or victims after divorce, cold, detached, or broken. But reality is far more complex. Many go through silent transformations that the world never sees. Behind closed doors, they read, they reflect, they journal, they walk alone. Not because they have given up, but because they are learning to live consciously for the first time.
And it's in this quiet rebirth that meaning returns. The man no longer defines himself by titles, husband, father, provider, but by principles, awareness, responsibility, and inner peace. What once felt like punishment becomes an initiation into authenticity. For some, it takes months, for others, years. But eventually, the pain that once defined them becomes wisdom that guides them. They learn to love again, not from need, but from understanding. They learn to listen, not just to others, but to themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they realize that life after divorce is not the end of the story. It's the first chapter of becoming whole. So, what happens to your husband after divorce? He breaks, he struggles, he questions, and if he's willing to face the silence, he grows. The end of a marriage is not the end of his meaning. It's the moment he begins to discover it.